Hello from the United States, and welcome to the Unveiling of FREIA, the world's only full-body fascia plastinate. I'm Barbara Bellanova, Executive Director of Fascia Research Society. In a moment, I will be turning you over to the team in Berlin. People are asking if there's sound on. Can everyone hear me? Great, thank you. Let me continue. In a moment, I will be turning you over to the team in Berlin, but first to the members of Fascia Research Society who are joining us here today, and to all the others who are not. On behalf of the Fascia Research Society Board of Directors and myself, we want to thank you for being a part of this unique and respected organization. We are looking forward to seeing you in Montreal next September for the 6th International Fascia Research Congress. Also, on behalf of the FRS board and myself, we want to thank everyone involved in bringing FREIA to the world. It is without a doubt FREIA will change, inform, and educate how researchers and manual therapists understand the fascial system. Toward the end of our broadcast today, we will have a brief Q&A session with questions from the audience. You can type your questions throughout the broadcast in the chat box. While we won't be able to answer them all, we will do our very best to answer as many as time allows. Once again, welcome to this extraordinary event, the Unveiling of FREIA, the world's first full-body plastinate. And now we will join Dr. Angelina Wally, the curator and CEO of Body Worlds, and the FREIA team in Berlin.
First and foremost, Barbara, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you watch. We have quite an international audience today from all over the world for this very special moment. We're here live in Berlin, right in the center of Berlin at the Body Worlds Museum. I'm sure the vast majority of you is familiar with the concept of Body Worlds. It's a touring exhibition on the human body that features real anatomical specimens that are permanently preserved by a technology called plastination. And Body Worlds is particularly known for its very spectacular, very detailed, dissected anatomical specimens that shows the human anatomy down to the finest level. But our approach has always been very traditional. Like the anatomists of the past 500 years, we never really paid much attention on the connective tissue. It typically ended up in the dissection waste. And that thinking changed dramatically when we were approached by Dr. Robert Schleib. I'm sure you know Robert. He is one of the most recognized fascia researcher in the world. He contacted us around 3-4 years ago and asked us, wouldn't you prepared to work on an entire body that would emphasize the fascial structure? Well, I must say we were a little reluctant, or not only a little reluctant, not that we didn't find the project interesting enough, but the question was, how could we accomplish an entire body that would emphasize a system that is responsible to interconnect everything else? As soon as you open up the body, you have altered the system already. So what could we take away? What could we dissect without losing this interconnectivity that we ought to unveil? It was absolutely clear it would require a complete different approach, a complete different dissection principle that differed completely from our traditional work. In addition, we were of course aware that plastination would have a major impact on the final result. So we were in no way certain that we wouldn't end up with a specimen that would surface ours and all others' expectations. But what Robert, he kept on being very smart and very charming as always, but equally persisting, so we finally agreed. That was around 3 years ago. And fortunately enough, we didn't have to do this on our own, because very soon volunteers came up from the Fascia Society saying, wow, we would be really more than happy to join the project and help you dissecting. So we had more than 20 volunteers working in our labs in Germany, and I'm sure many of them are currently watching this program. And I have to express our utmost gratitude and respect for all your work and all your dedication, coming all the way from all the various places from the world, joining us in Germany, in your free time, on your own expense. That was really a wonderful contribution that you made. And I'm sure in a moment we will unveil FREIA, and you will agree it was worth each and every effort. So thank you so much. I'm sure you won't be disappointed. I'm very happy to introduce now those two people who were absolutely crucial for the success of the entire project. And first and foremost, I have to introduce you to Dr. Vladimir Chereminsky. Vladimir is an anatomist. He is originating from Kyrgyzstan, and he's working with us in plastination for now more than 25 years. Vladimir, without your dedication, without your expertise in both anatomy and plastination, I guess we would have never been able to accomplish a project like this. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your introduction.
But of course, it cannot be a one-man show. It needs a sparring partner that would help to discuss things and to point out what is necessary and what we ought to change. And that is where our next guest stepped in, and that is Gary Carter from the UK. Gary, thank you so much for all your dedication. Gary, you should know, he is a very experienced anatomical teacher, particularly in fascia anatomy. And for the past 30 years, he has also been a manual therapist. So all his expertise, and particularly his practical experience, were absolutely essential for the entire success of the project. You both were really the brains behind the project. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And I'm also pleased to introduce two further guests today, and that is first and foremost Rachel Clausen. Rachel, she is one of these volunteers. I guess she was the most dedicated one. She flew in from the United States, from San Diego, 7 times to work with us 7 weeks in a row. And I'm so glad you are here, and together with our next guest, Dr. Robert Schleip, you both will moderate this special evening tonight. But before we continue with the unveiling, and I'm sure everyone is already very curious, Robert, can you please share with us again your thoughts that you had in the beginning? Why did you feel a project like FREIA is so important? What was your thought about it? What was your expectation, and what was your experience along the way seeing the project being realized?
Well, first of all, a huge thank you to Gunther von Hagens for inventing plastination, and for him and his whole team for bringing body worlds into the world. And it has had a big impact on my life. I went to many of the exhibitions. It had a big impact on me personally, and also for my respect for the miracle called life and how precious it is whenever I go to this exhibition. Yet, whenever I went to these exhibitions, I kept thinking fascia could be more emphasized in it than it already is included. And that's how I reached out to you several times. And finally, we got together with a small team. And I must say, what has been achieved now is so much larger than anything we could have developed ourselves. And that, for me, is the biggest surprise of the whole project, how the team spirit of dozens of people from all over the world who are inspired by fascia, who are coming together, bringing in their passion, bringing in their debates, questions. So I learned a lot that if you want to understand fascia, it works very well to become a good networker. So I'm very overwhelmed by whatever has been achieved, and my personal contribution is very small compared with what we are seeing today.
But you kept the ball rolling, and thanks to your passionate pushing make us decide for this project, and looking backwards, it was really worth the effort. So I think now it's a perfect moment to go ahead and let everyone see our new beauty.
So after the unveiling, we will invite you to take a moment to follow the camera in live for this very precious moment. Where dozens of people from all over the world have worked. In the history of anatomy, this is quite unique, that we emphasize the tissue that normally lands in the garbage bin of the dissector.
Well, welcome everyone. We're so very pleased to have you with us this morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are, and to invite you to a deeper look to the story of FREIA. We have been looking forward to this day for a very long time, as many of you probably all have as well. Whether you know a lot about fascia or you know very little, we are sure that in the upcoming moments you're having a lot to see and a lot to enjoy.
So Rochelle and I, we have spent a lot of time with FREIA, but we imagined that some of you may have some questions from a manual or movement therapy perspective or from a scientific perspective. So we invite you to sit back while we direct some of these questions to Dr. Chereminsky and to Gary Carter.
So let's get started with our very first question and our first up-close look at fascia. So Dr. Chereminsky, we'd like to start just by saying that we know that Body Worlds is full of many beautiful plastinates, but as was being discussed earlier, a lot of these plastinates were dissected from a classical anatomy point of view. So from that point of view, did you demonstrate fascia in any of the plastinates before now?
Yeah, although we are quite traditional so in presenting anatomy, human anatomy, Body Worlds exhibition has definitely several specimens which display certain fascia elements or fragments of fascia. But FREIA is absolutely unique project because this is the first whole body plastinate ever which is displaying almost all the possible types of fascia on one body, from the very superficial ones, like subcutaneous tissue, to the superficial fascia, down to the deep fascia, internal fascia of the thoracic cavity, and also the visceral fascia of the mediastinum, and visceral fascia of the neck.
Dr. Chereminsky, when you started this project with us together, what did you expect to achieve?
What did I expect to achieve? The first, the first goal and the main goal of this project was to bring the understanding of fascia, I think in the simplest way which is possible, to the general public and also to professionals. Yeah, so my initial task was to incorporate as much as possible types of fascia on one body. And so we have achieved this. During our long discussions, I think we decided to put on this body, on the FREIA, both the classical representation of fascia and also the functional or dynamic anatomy of fascia. Gary, if I'm wrong,
no,
you can correct me.
I fully agree. No, I see that classical anatomy doesn't necessarily give us an understanding of what movement is. So where we start to look at the fascial anatomy, that links everything together and it describes movement in a much better way. But as we've had these many discussions before, you can't throw away the classical anatomy. I think the classical anatomy has to be deeply respected, and we blend the two elements together. That's really, really important in my book.
The posture of FREIA is so striking and very elegant. I'm wondering, and our audience maybe too, is there any particular reason that this posture was chosen, or does it have anything to do with what's actually trying to be shown through the dissection as well?
Well, after speaking with the scientific advisors and getting their ideas, what I took from that is the common theme actually from the scientific advisors was continuity. So many ideas, but continuity was the main theme. And from there I took Vladimir's initial design, and we started to introduce elements of design from the leaders within the fascia research field. And by doing that, really, we have FREIA as our first fascial focus plastinate, introducing all of those ideas into it. And also what we've done is kept one of the traditional anatomical dissection ideas, which is to have the superficial tissues on the right side and then slightly deeper tissues on the left side, but we've done it with a fascial focus. So respect to the classical, but then come at that from a fascial focus. So from there, keeping continuity, what we're looking at is continuity from surface to depth and then from head to foot. So if I can then bring our camera round towards FREIA's left elbow, and I'll come behind our camera person here. So if we're looking at FREIA's left elbow, as we start to sweep across FREIA, what we're looking at are sweeps and curves and spirals that sweep down the back of her body. But also what we look at in one of the spirals is the posterior oblique sling. So we've got the latissimus dorsi and its associated fascia, the thoracolumbar fascia going into the gluteus maximus and its associated fascia, which is delving deep underneath what would be the adipose tissue. And then what we see is these tissues and the more superficial tissues sweeping around her body, so that we've got much more of a fluid line that runs through her body, and then it wraps around her leg and goes underneath her heel. And if the camera just gently sweeps out a little bit more, we take that form and that shape in. And really these sort of fluid qualities in her form are depicting the kind of movement patterns that we see in fascial movement trainings. And along with that, what we find is the twist in her torso is linking the posterior oblique sling as well.
So beautiful. It's so nice to see all the curved lines as opposed to the square cuts, because the body really isn't linear in squares and
Absolutely.
angles. Everything
So
is
in fact, the
curved
fluidity,
and
the fluidity is depicting also the flow that we understand in fascial movement, and in terms of also how we might work with our hands too.
Good point. Yeah.
So what would you say is the main difference from this new functional fascia-oriented perspective towards the traditional classical perspective of the human body?
Yeah, I think, from my opinion, there is quite a big difference. Although we know that fascia is a Cinderella tissue, yeah, Robert? But we should remember that fascia was studied and very well described already in 18th and 19th centuries in regards to surgical approaches, to distribution, to split, and to the split of inflammatory processes, also in trauma surgery and in reconstructive surgery as well. So fascia and fascial septa thought to split, to separate organs and structures like muscles from the nerves and vessels, thought to be fascial compartments or fascial sheath. So we have prepared here a couple of such classical examples, like on this lower abdominal portion. We have made a classical window into the fascial sheath of rectus abdominis muscle. And down there, on the lower leg, we have shown the classical representation of the musculofascial compartments.
So speaking of dissection, did you have more to say?
Yeah, so
Yes, sorry.
yeah, oppositely in functional anatomy, I remember, so the fascia is the main element of continuity.
Yeah, that's so interesting to learn these differences. But speaking of the different dissections, Gary, you and I were in the dissection lab together with Dr. Cherminsky quite a lot. And I think a lot of the viewers also have probably taken some dissection workshops that had a fascial focus to them, as you have in the past. Was there much of a difference in your experience from dissecting for the purpose of learning about fascia anatomy versus creating a fascial plastinate?
Yes, as Dr. Angelina Wally said at the opening, it's a different way of thinking. When we're classically in dissection labs, and we've both been in those together with various colleagues, we might be in there for 6 days or 10 days. But what we find in that process is that we're having to move through the tissue structures very quickly. So we're learning as we go, but we're doing it at a particular pace. And most of that tissue is being taken down and then removed, and then go to the next structure, taken down, and it's removed. But here we're dissecting to preserve. So we're dissecting, preserving, dissecting, preserving. And a comment that we used to say when we were in the lab together is that we are removing fascial tissue to display fascial tissue, which was always quite interesting to go through that process. But along with that is that the fascial structures that are removed or separated from the underlying structures, after a period of time, become quite vulnerable, quite weak. They lose their support. And we had to be very careful in terms of FREIA, because the whole body here is dissected. This is the thing. From every part of her was considered. So obviously she's been turned around a lot. So we would have to protect those fascial membranes that were reflected. So what we were also understanding from that is that the structures that the fascia has been reflected from, the fascia is dependent upon that structure for its strength.
Right.
But also the structures underneath are dependent on the fascia for its support and shape and function. So they're completely interdependent with each other, which we've understood it, but to see it and to feel it is a big experience there. And along the way, as we're dissecting, we had to keep considering how the final form would appear. So, as you know, there was constant readaptations to design, because we knew at some point, oh, that's not going to display very well. Let's remodel it. Let's look at that 2 o'clock in the morning drawings, and so on and so on and so on. That went on forever. So it's a very different way of thinking, and I think that way of thinking has stayed with me forever. Thank you.
I think also the length of time that's required for this is, you don't really think about, like, to create something like this, it have to go day in and day out and day in, and over the course of 6 months was this project for just dissecting, which you can see it was 6 months worth of work at the very least.
It's almost the longest dissection
that you've ever had. The detail,
really,
because of the delicacy, was so challenging.
Yeah, we've had that discussion as well, where you're saying it is the longest, and because it's the first of its kind, it takes up a lot of time.
Really amazing. So kind of in that same vein with the manual therapists and the movement practitioners, how do you see that FREIA, what can FREIA offer them to help them in a practical sense? Like, what would be the clinical applications that they might gain from being able to see FREIA now that she's been completed?
From a manual therapy point of view. So as a manual therapist, what we've decided to do is to maintain the skin. So if we can bring the camera to the back of FREIA once again, and once again I'll come to the left of our camera person. So what we decided to do is to keep the skin. And Robert Schleiper come into our lab at one point, and he looked at the plans and the design, and he said to me, "Oh, you're keeping the skin." And we had suggested, well, the skin is collagen based. It's part of a fascial structure, but as a manual therapist, it's the region we touch. That's the only way that we start to make contact with the body is through the skin. And what we've done here in keeping the skin intact is that we've reflected the skin slightly, and we can still see the skin ligaments in touch with or continuous to the next tissue down, which is the superficial fascia. That then takes us through continuously to the deep fascia, to the epimysial fascia of the muscle, of which the epimysium then invests the muscle tissue. But between these surfaces, we have a loose areolar fascia. So what that does is that permits glide from one surface to the next. And if we can bring the camera down just to the mid-lower back region, what we see here is maybe a little bit more relationship between these particular surfaces, and this is quite a deep region into the lumbar tissue. But it's the textures that we're really interested in, and if we can really learn to appreciate the textures, and I quote Gil Headley there because he's the person that really brought this to light, is that once we can start to understand those textures, we really start to have a different sense of what we're doing in our clinical practice. And for me, it's made a huge difference in clinical practice because in terms of treatment of low back pain, how we might deal with neck issues or frozen shoulder, it makes a big difference to the way that we treat. And we're just keeping the camera where it is just to look at that view, and I'll keep talking. When we understand tensional relationships in the body, that really helps us to work on scar tissue and understand how to treat scar tissue, and also how we start to treat injury too. Thank you.
I think it's really remarkable to see what's beneath the skin so that you know what it is that you're feeling. We talk about having your fingers become like they have x-ray vision, and the touch becomes more sharp and more precise. And after seeing that and interacting with it, I think without going into the dissection lab actually, that there's a possibility of that being shared.
It's so informative.
It's really great.
I remember that you, Vladimir, convinced us to show the architecture of one tissue layer like the superficial fascia, not only in one region but in many areas. So why was that so important?
Yeah, because so different areas have different functions, of course, different functions and different anatomical features as well. Let's take an example of the subcutaneous tissue. Here, for example, here on the abdominal area, adipose lobules are linked to the weak elastic network, so which is basically explains the sagging of the adipose tissue due to obesity, so the belly sagging. Oppositely to that, can we go a little bit down here? So the stroma of the subcutaneous tissue of the limbs is quite very well developed. That's why it have the ability to maintain the shape and maintain the nice configuration of the extremities, even due to some excessive adipose tissue on them. If we take a close look, that's another point. If you take a close look at the adipose tissue and the subcutaneous tissue here on the thigh, you can see these small threads of blood vessels, which is showing how well subcutaneous tissue is vascularized. This also explains why obese people have increased blood volume and also high blood pressure. Imagine that 1 kilogram of adipose tissue required about 10 kilometers of blood vessels.
Wow. That's remarkable. Wow. Very good. So maybe some continuities.
Yeah. So that was the next question. You emphasized very much, Gary, that we should include as much force transmission continuities as possible. And from the many different options, you included a lot of them. Can you just pick 2 or 3 of force transmission lines?
We have a lot of various examples of continuity around FREIA.
That was a big topic in our group.
Different degrees. So if I go to this side of our camera person once again, a wonderful camera person, can bring the camera through here. What we have here is into the axilla, so the area of the armpit. First of all, we have the pectoralis major reflected, and then what we've done from that is reflected the pectoralis fascia. And you can see the pectoralis fascia is actually quite thick. It's not really that thick in reality in dissection. It's much thinner than that. It was a tissue we were worried about, but during plastination it's thickened up, which is actually works in our favour. But what we also see is that this pectoralis fascia is continuous all the way around and then becomes the brachial fascia. As that becomes the brachial fascia, it's also continuous down here to the latissimus dorsi fascia as well. So latissimus dorsi fascia and pectoralis fascia actually make one myofascial continuity along with other structures. Thank you, David Lizondak, for that. And that takes us on to the brachial fascia. And so those 2 are continuous onto the brachial fascia, and then we come around onto the antebrachial fascia. And if the camera could come around, because it's one of my I've got so many favourite parts of FREIA, but I love the sweep and the tension that we see through this quality of the tissue here. But we know that all of this tissue is well innervated with sensory nerve endings, and they become much more abundant as they travel towards the wrist. So that gives credence to the arm's position and its proprioception in space. If we can then bring the camera round to FREIA's right arm, and FREIA's right palm is facing up, and it looks like she's trying to tickle Vladimir from there. And what we're looking at is the lateral portion of the arm. And we've got many windows here, but it's this particular window that I'm interested in seeing. This is a very familiar cut. Rochelle knows this very well. It's a cut that we've named in the lab called the canoe cut. This gives reference to Carla Stecco's work from her book, where we see the muscular fibres get their origin from the fascial surround. So they are continuous to the antebrachial fascia. So muscle, of course, is continuous to its tendon. Muscle is, of course, continuous to the next muscle along the line, but also it gets, in certain parts of the body, its continuity or attachments to the antebrachial fascia. So simply put, what it does when it engages is it sucks that fascial surround closer to it, increasing the pressure, which brings more efficiency to the muscular action. And I'm all one for efficiency when it comes to movement of the body. If we can then sweep the camera around, and we'll bring this round to FREIA's left foot. So the foot that she's standing on. And if we just have a little bit of a view of the Achilles as well with the foot, what we see here is that FREIA is standing on the balls of her left foot. And we see a lot of force applied through the plantar fascia. And that force is still going to be there even though she's placed onto the stand. And that force transmission goes across the calcaneus and then onto the Achilles tendon. This is a very well-known myofascial continuity. And in fact, if you actually want to embody FREIA's standing position, whilst you're here viewing, why don't you come and stand on your left ball of your left foot, put your right foot forwards and take your right arm out to the side and twist, and you'll know exactly how much this region's got to take. I don't know whether you just fell over just then. So here we've got the plantar fascia, and usually the plantar fascia in anatomy books is described as a separate structure. And in some body worlds exhibits, not all of them of course, we see the plantar fascia described as a separate structure too. However, the flexor digitorum brevis muscle, which is deep to the plantar fascia, is also continuous to it. So you can see some of the fibres there. We weren't able to get all of them, but we see some of the fibres coming into the foot and making it continuous. So thank you for that question, Laura.
Yeah, that's really amazing, all of these deep fascia connections, but there's a lot of superficial fascia that's on FREIA as well, and there's no fat in this superficial fascia post-plastinated, right? So it's a very interesting thing to even know that fact, because there's still a lot of tissue there without adipose. It's also kind of a complicated tissue, isn't it?
Yeah. So as you've just right described. And what we've got is, in my mind, one of the first body whorls forms that I've seen with probably the most superficial fascia on it. But I don't know, that might be somewhere in the world, I'm not sure. But this is the most that I've seen. And this would usually be known as adipose tissue as well, but there's no adipose tissue in this, as you rightly said. It's the architecture that holds that together, it's left behind. So the adipose tissue has been separated from that and removed, and we have this architecture. In the fascia community, this region as a whole is known as superficial fascia, but in a clinical setting, the superficial fascia is a membrane that sits deeper within the adipose tissue, separating the deep adipose tissue from the superficial adipose tissue. However, Vladimir will be able to give us an example of where this is present on FREIA's body and its clinical relevance. So over to you, Vladimir.
Thank you. Yeah, there are a lot of confusions and misunderstanding in the interpretation of the superficial fascia and also in the terminology. That's why we basically wanted to show one classical example of the superficial fascia, and we expose it here on the lower abdominal quadrant. That's a Scarpa's fascia, which is partially reflected from the deep fascia of the abdomen, and it still has some continuity to the deep fascia.
It looks to me like an unhealthy adhesion. Would you agree?
Yes.
We see on the upper.
Yeah, on the
portion,
inferior portion, that's the healthy continuity. And you are right. So on the upper portion of the Scarpa's fascia, you can see the scar from the appendectomy.
Ah, so it's from surgery.
It's a fusion, so to say.
So these adhesions can be created by surgery, but they could also be created by lack of movement.
All right. So very well.
Really cool.
So another area where I remember we had lots of discussions because it is very special is the whole head and neck area. We had to emphasize which fascial continuities to emphasize. Can you explain what we now incorporated into this fascia specimen?
Yeah, that was actually one of my favorite part of the dissection.
I remember.
I spent quite a bit of time doing cranial dissection. So here we have shown both the superficial fascial elements and also the deep fascias, the temporal fascia as a deep fascia. From the superficial elements, we have presented here 3 layers: the skin, subcutaneous tissue here, and galla aponeurotica or epicranial aponeurosis. So this kind of construction is quite important in trauma surgery. Basically, it explains the severity of the head injuries, the injuries of the soft tissues of the cranium. Also, we can see the continuity of the epicranial aponeurosis to another superficial fascia of the head. That's a parieto-temporal fascia, which is very often used in the reconstructive surgery because of its very, very good vascularization. You can see by the superficial temporal artery here. So, and the next layer, that's a temporal fascia, is a deep fascia, right?
So that continuity might also explain some types of tensional headache, that they reach up into these fascial layers.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are several scientific works on it. And here we have exposed continuity of the cranial fascias. Could you please go a little bit backwards here? Yeah. Continuity of the cranial fascia to the neck fascia or cervical fascia. The deep cervical fascia, deep neck fascia, has basically 3 layers. The layer or leaflet which is presented here, that's an investing fascia or investing leaflet, which surrounds the trapezius muscle, and sternocleidomastoideus muscle. That's a more superficial lamina. The second one, or middle lamina of the cervical fascia, or pretracheal fascia, envelopes the infrahyoid muscles here. And another quite important fascia, we shouldn't forget about this, that's a visceral fascia of the neck, which is continuation of the buccopharyngeal fascia. So this fascia envelopes all the cervical viscera and continues inferiorly through the thoracic aperture into the thoracic cavity, forms the mediastinal visceral fascia.
It is very nicely shown.
Exactly, it's very nicely shown. And so this mediastinal visceral fascia connects to the fibrous pericardium. So the deepest layer of the cervical fascia, that's a prevertebral fascia, which has also very important practical value. First of all, it forms the retroesophageal space together with the visceral fascia, and second, it forms the neurofascial sheath, which continues along the nerves of the brachial plexus, continues into the axillary area, which basically explains transmission of the inflammatory processes from the neck area to the axillary area and other way around. So, and it's beautifully represented here.
I think it's so dramatic and amazing that this dissection design allows us to go all the way inside and back out again to see those deep continuities.
We can speak hours about the clinical importance on this particular body. Yeah.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we don't have hours as much as we would love to, and we think you might as well, but we do have one final prepared question, which Gary would like to ask. Just as we now have FREIA as a demonstration of the full body fascial system, how do you see as an educator that this may affect or impact fascia education moving forward?
Well, firstly, I just wanted to sit there and listen to Vladimir for ages, because what he's just talking about, I want to keep looking into that region, into the thorax.
That one last time.
Yeah, we've seen that so many times. But as Vladimir and I have described on FREIA, there's so much to see through a 3D plastinate. Also, there's a lot to see through dissection too. But I spent a lot of time teaching in Body Worlds in London when it was there, and taking groups around to the models there. And I had to go from model to model to model to model to try and get some kind of vision and piece together how the fascia would look to my students. And what we've got here in one piece, which again was so long putting together, is that we've got various areas that we could educate with, and we could spend, actually I know we could spend more than hours, it could probably be a few days.
Weeks, maybe months.
But also with FREIA, we've got about 40, up to at least 40 features in her.
Wow.
So what we call vignettes between us, and each one tells a fascial story, and I think that's quite remarkable. So, you know, I think in imaging of 3D modelling of fascia, for us to be able to see it, learning to see this in 3D is something we've always wanted to do, and to be able to have that on a full plastinate that's focused with fascia is astounding. I'm in awe. And yeah, I just think it's exciting for our future of fascial anatomy. That's got me emotional.
Yeah. I think we share that with you and feel it really strongly. Thank you so much for the amazing, informative time that you've spent answering these questions, but we think you may have some more questions on the other side of the camera. So we're going to reach back to Barbara and find out if there's any questions that you have sent in that you might like to ask of the team. I'd like to invite Angelina to come back up and join us in case she has some questions that you might want to direct her way as well.
Fantastic. Hello again, everyone. There have been a number of questions in the chat box and just in the regular chat about how was the positioning of FREIA arrived at? What process did you go through? What determined the posturing?
So, shall I start? Do you mind?
Please
I
go
think
ahead.
we had a posturing idea from Vladimir to start with, and that was in a mouthful. And then we saw that there was a female form.
It will be changed.
Yeah, we had no idea at that point, and we saw a female form, and we started with a dancer's posture, and then that readapted, and then Angelina continued on the process with that.
Yes, it was. So we were following our initial plans, and but when the work continued in the laboratory, I personally felt it doesn't feel right. She looked as if she would throw her art away. So what Volodya told me, now it was already pre-positioned. There's not much that we can change. So we looked through books depicting dancers and found an image that was very similar to what we had already achieved. And then we ended up with this beautiful bow. So I'm very pleased, actually.
Stunning.
Yes, she's definitely beautiful. Lots of comments about her beauty. The next question, I found this one fascinating myself, is how did you handle the cutaneous nerves that pierce through fascia?
Ooh.
How did we handle them?
So we kept, I can answer this question. So we kept some of the cutaneous nerves, but some of them we had to remove together with the piece of the subcutaneous tissue and together with the skin, of course, yeah.
And that was one of the many sacrifices, because we discussed whether we should emphasize them in order to honor the correlations with traditional Chinese medicine. But that would have been a completely different exhibition, and that's why we clearly followed Dr. Chereminsky's advice to focus on the deeper layers.
Okay. I also found this question very interesting. It's from Amanda, and she said, how do you envision this piece will illuminate the understanding on the body for ordinary folks? So not manual therapists, not doctors, researchers.
From my experience of teaching in various body worlds, just how I see public, and some of the public came along and tagged on to some of my sessions, they found them quite interesting to be able to see the structure from a different perspective, which gave them a different understanding as to how they would need to or would like to explore their body. By seeing it differently, we find that they start moving it differently and treat it differently. And that's really been quite exciting for me to see.
Another aspect not so much shown in this session is the other specimen around here, which are focusing on the biotensecity model. And that is very interactive, and that will be a secondary emphasis in people coming to this exhibition, that they explore if you have a local problem, you may look for solutions in other areas of the body. And that is very nicely, they have an interactive station where you massage the plantar fascia, and then your arm length gets longer and you're pushing some magnets down. We have all these tensegrity models here, so that would be definitely a strong secondary outcome for all the visitors.
Absolutely.
Well, from my experience, being the curator of all of our Body Worlds exhibitions since its very beginning, I know that lay people, they don't come to learn anatomy. That's way too much. But it is all about gaining an image, getting an understanding. And that's almost like a seed that you plant, drawing the interest to something and creating an image to something that they perhaps suffer from. So they are really interested, but they don't have an image. And this is what Body Worlds allows for, to really get an idea of what the topic is about. And I'm absolutely sure, even though many lay people will not really identify the various fascial layers, but still it will provide an overall image what fascia is about. And I think this is really important to understand the needs, the physical needs of our body, particularly in a time when we can achieve almost anything while sitting, while not moving. I think this is absolutely essential that we get this understanding across and make people move again.
Well said.
Very well, yes.
So here's another fascinating question. And it asks, what did you leave out that you wish you could have displayed?
Oh, Well, I mean, there's the deep aspect to the visceral fascia, but we knew at some point that this was going to be primarily a superficial fascial structure in terms of the fascias on the surfaces of the body, and just with a few peeks into the depths, because we didn't know the terrain that we were really going to find, and also how that tissue was going to handle the plastination process. So we had to hold ourselves back a little bit and at least give an entry to the world with FREIA until maybe the next sessions could go deeper, if should that happen in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we also kept intact some areas where we could have opened and exposed to the visceral fascia, for instance, of the abdomen. But in this case, we should sacrifice the abdominal wall, or the fascia of the abdominal wall. So that's a rule of anatomy, you should sacrifice them.
So that was a constant debate. How much detail are we showing and how much continuity do we allow?
Well, I think also with the beauty of body worlds is that you see, you know, the human form displayed in multiple ways.
Yeah.
You know, we could display it 100 ways, and there could be another 100 ways that could display it all over again. And I think with the fascial body, that we could just keep doing that forever and forever and forever.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Maybe not.
Also, we always would say that we have to take something away to show something else. And so that thing that once it's gone, like you said in the beginning, I found that constant decision process really fascinating to be a part of, because you kind of want to show everything, but if you want to see everything, that's just basically you.
Exactly.
Uncompromised.
Very good. So there's been a couple questions along these lines. What was the hardest part or challenge to keep the tissue as one continuous form?
I think, as maybe I described earlier, where we're removing or separating structures from the underlying structures is where I think we had challenges in continuity, because we very quickly realized that if we just left them the way that they were, and the time that was spent working on her, those tissues would have damaged and they would have broken with continuity. So it was how we had to keep preserving and protecting. So she's been very protected as we go down the line.
Good, very good. A couple people have asked if we could see FREIA one more time. I'm wondering if that's possible, if the camera could just do a quick sweep. I think a lot of people would love to see her one more time. Is that possible?
I think
Absolutely, but I think this is what was our plan anyway, toward the end of the session.
That's how we're ending, yeah.
Very good. Very good. Okay, everybody can wait for that then. Let's see. I think all the questions that we had are pretty much what have been asked so far. So this might be a good time to bring this to a close. There's just been so many wonderful comments in the comment section. I hope all of you get a chance to take a look at them. Lots of thank yous, lots of really wonderful, wonderful things. So that's that part. And just bring this to a little bit of a closing. And it's going to continue with a handover to Dr. Wally again. But I just want to thank you so much personally and from the board of directors of the Fascia Research Society for our time together is coming to a close. And we're also very pleased you were able to join us today. Once again, I'm going to be turning the broadcast over to Berlin. But before I do that, I'd really like everybody to give a virtual standing ovation to this team and their incredible work. This has just been so outstanding. Thank you so very, very, very much. Amazing, amazing. Amazing work, amazing work. Also, I want to remind everybody today, if you want to see FREIA up close and personal, she will be at the 6th International Fascia Research Congress in Montreal in September. We had quite a few questions about that. Again, I just want to thank you for being here today on behalf of all of us. This has been a wonderful, extraordinary experience. And now I'm going to hand this back to Dr. Wally in Berlin.
I want to join in and cordially thank everyone who was part of the team, who contributed really a lot. We have achieved something that we can all be very, very proud of. Thanks to you all, to all the dissectors, to all the scientific advisors. Thanks to you for this wonderful presentation. And last but not least, thanks to the team behind this event here, who really worked for 2-3 days minimum get everything set up and to test and to make this really a great event. I do hope you equally enjoyed this event. Now we will finish our presentation by more close-up of FREIA. It will be followed up by a rolling list of credits, and at the very end you are invited to join to see images that were taken while working on FREIA. So I do hope you enjoyed it, and I wish you a wonderful day, a wonderful evening, and I do hope one day you have the chance to see FREIA in person. It's absolutely a different experience. Of course, you will be in Montreal for the Fascia Research Congress, but FREIA will be on permanent display at our Body Worlds Museum in Berlin. And as you've heard, it's not only FREIA, we have dedicated an entire section of our exhibition to the theme of fascia. There's a lot to see, a lot to learn. Come and visit us. So goodbye and have a wonderful day. Please.